silence, please all rise. Sorry, Chief.
Be seated, thank you.
The hearing resumes.
Dr. Diamond.
Thank you very much, Chief Commissioner. And yes, if you haven't already said so, once again we join with the other parties in congratulating you for your elevation.
That's very kind of you, thank you.
So for the, may it please the Commission in Court session, I present the Unions WA position on increasing award and minimum wages. Unions WA relies on its submissions, initial submissions and submissions in reply to make its main points for our claim to increase award wages on statutory minimum wage by $30.40 per week or 4%, whichever is greater. However, we would seek to expand on some of our points just in this presentation.
Yes, certainly.
The formulation $30.40 per week or by 4%, whichever it's greater, is a formulation that Unions WA has used before. Over a number of years, we've had various formulations that put a dollar figure at the bottom, if you like, and a percentage increase at the top. It's no reason to be paranoid about it. It says what it says. And of course, the way those increases flow on to minimum and award, to junior rates, to apprenticeships and trainees, etc., are indeed set by legislation. But we do, of course, affirm the point that we would like the full benefit of those increases, whatever is decided, to flow on to those parties as well. But ultimately, of course, the point of the exercise is that Unions WA contends that the Commission should make a substantial real wage increase for award-reliant workers. There's been a lot of discussion before lunch about uncertainties about economic arrangements, uncertainties about data, but we would make the point that workers have uncertainties as well, employees have uncertainties as well, and they have uncertainties about their incomes and their wage levels going forward. And we would like to have the Commission consider those uncertainties too. Now, in our submissions, Unions WA has made the case that wage growth in WA and the rest of Australia needs the decisions of binding institutional measures such as the minimum wage. There is a huge amount of inertia in both the private and public sectors that is holding back wage growth. The lack of wage growth is not justified, if it ever was, by a lack of growth in the economy. Rather, it is being held back by deliberate decisions made by governments and business owners. And these decisions reflect the fundamental power imbalances in the labour market in which workers are price takers. Now, we did indeed outline some of the theory behind this in our initial submission when we talked about monopsony labour theory. I should say as a note that this is not simply an American theory of labour markets. One of the lead theorists, Alan Manning, is British. And as far as American labour theories go, once again, America and its economy are not another planet. They are a capitalist economy just like us. They have employers who pay a price for labour and hire workers accordingly. And George Stigler, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote The Economics of the Minimum Wage, which imagined, wrongly in our view, that minimum wages operate in a perfectly competitive market, was also American too. We would also sort of make the point that the sort of lack of willingness to increase wages on the part of governments and on the part of business owners is not something that Unions WA has simply recognised. It is recognised as well by the Reserve Bank. The most recent minutes of the Monetary Policy meeting of the Reserve Bank Board for the 4th of May contain the following statement. Wage and price inflation were at much lower levels than over the preceding decades, and because of inertia in wage and price setting practices, it is possible that price pressures could be slow to build even if spare capacity were absorbed more quickly than expected. We point out that the most recent unemployment figures in Western Australia that were of course released today, unemployment 4.9%, down 0.1 in Western Australia. Underemployment also down, 7.1 down 0.3. Have occurred at the same time, or rather simultaneous, with yesterday's release of the Wage Price Index, which showed that WA has the lowest quarterly rise in the Wage Price Index, equal lowest state on the annual rise of 1.4%, and the lowest rise for the quarter at 0.4%. So once again, if wages were simply following demand for labour, you would expect WA wages to be going higher along with the increase in demand for labour. But that appears to be not the case. And an interesting point that sticks out in the unemployment rate is, of course, that, as has been mentioned, participation rate was down slightly as well. We think that you should consider this, or the Commission should consider this, in the light of incentives for labour supply as well. It's been discussed, what are the incentives for people to seek out full-time work? What's the reason to have full-time work? Full-time work, the value of full-time work is precisely that it allows for a stronger income, for more security, and sort of higher wages. If the full-time work that's on offer is not in fact providing any of those things, then there is a lack of incentive for people to step out and offer themselves within the labour market as well. So, moving along, the issue around wage freezes in the private sector is something that we emphasised, and is something that once again has been emphasised by the Reserve Bank. The fact that businesses are maintaining wage freezes in a situation where the economy is growing, unemployment is falling, I should say, and employer complaints about both labour and skill shortages have been increasing, shows that institutional increases in measures such as the minimum wage are desperately needed. And in terms of whether WA shortages in the labour market are around skills, I'd just remind the Commissioner that earlier in the year 2020, the state government put together an entire advertising campaign around trying to encourage people to go out to the horticultural sector in order to take up the predominantly unskilled labour that was there because of the normal supply of backpackers, international students, etc. wasn't around. So that's an obvious case where there's a sort of labour shortage acting in Western Australia. And the issues around the closure of borders are also an issue, of course, that impact workers as well. Workers are participants in the WA labour market, but they're also participants in the national labour market as well. And the various closing of state borders also puts workers at a disadvantage when it comes for asking for a higher price for their labour. And it's the case that governments, both state and federal, in their budgets, the most recent federal budget, also in the material that was presented by Mr. Christmas, keep forecasting growth in household consumption, while also forecasting that there will be no real wage growth for years. This, to us, shows that governments are declining to use the policy mechanisms at their disposal. Those, of course, would include wages for their own public sector workforce, but also that they are declining, or at least not making as much use as they could, of institutional wage setting measures. And the point, and Mr. Christmas offered, which was that it's okay because people will be working through their savings, is something that really we should pause when considering whether minimum wage workers or award-reliant workers are actually going to have the level of savings that Mr. Christmas assumes when it comes to things like purchasing cars and making those upfront costs while they run down their savings. I mean, I'd say as an aside that the state governments It is indeed a classic bit of Keynesian economics to show that as the state government is maintaining a surplus, then the pressure to dissave and work into savings goes into households and goes into the citizenry. That's a classic bit of formula sort of made flesh under these circumstances. Now, what the CCIWA and the Minister are offering in their minimum wage claims are more wages inertia. There is no path forward on wages for either of them. Insofar as the use of bonuses by businesses may indicate a lack of confidence going forward in terms of what they can offer in terms of wage increases, the flip side of that would be that they're pretty confident that they're not actually going to be required to offer any wage increase and can pretty much get away with offering bonuses without any ongoing commitment or ongoing investment to wage increases. Now, as has already been touched on, the CCI has claimed that it wants no minimum wage increase until the national minimum wage catches up to the state, is an extension of this arbitrary price taker imposition on workers who are in the state award system. It's not any WA worker's fault that they're in the state system, and there is nothing in the IR Act that allows the Commission to use such a reason or a criteria to set minimum and award rates. It would indeed involve disregarding every criterion in the Act, and we think that it should be rejected on that point forward. Now, the Minister's claim for 2.5% increase or thereabouts, $19.20, does at least involve some increase, but as we made clear in the Unions WA reply submission, this is also a reformulation of the public sector wages policy into a minimum wage claim. Now, as such, it will reinforce the negative impacts of that policy on issues such as the gender pay gap, which were identified by Professor Preston. Once again, recalling the submissions that were made by Professor Preston, she noted that it is likely that slow wage growth in the WA public sector over successive years has contributed to a widening of the gender pay gap. Therefore, our view is if the Minister's claim is adopted, the slow wage growth in the WA public sector will be applied to the low wage private sector in Western Australia. Now, this repackaging, in our view, of the government's public sector wages policy for the minimum wage case also does not adequately consider the legislated criteria of the Industrial Relations Act for a minimum wage adjustment. The information in the Minister's submissions would indeed justify a much larger increase, not only on the grounds of addressing the gender pay gap, but also in terms of improving employment, the lack of response by wages to that improving employment, the large number of industries that are indeed recording increases in their gross operating surplus and gross mixed income, and that many low-paid workers are dependent on the increases in the state wage case to meet the challenges in their everyday living costs. And in terms of which businesses are impacted, or rather what accounts for WA's relative success going forward as an economy, the stress on sort of the role of the mining industry is all well and good on one level, but the invocation of, like, what if we didn't have the mining industry is a bit like asking what if Western Australia wasn't Western Australia. Like, Western Australia does have a mining industry. It's had one for many, many years. If the mining industry was doing badly, people certainly wouldn't be going around and saying, well, that's okay because we're allowed to, because it's a completely different set of the economy, therefore we can start lifting wages in the low wage sector. I think that, like, the fact that the mining sector is doing so much to sort of benefit the West Australian economy should not blind us to the fact that all West Australians deserve to have some kind of benefit from it. You mentioned the rising tide lifts all boats. It's also worth bearing in mind that we all, in one level, sort of have a stake in the mining industry and an investment, in the mining industry, and it's only right and proper that people should be able to benefit from it. So I don't think that the argument that it's all about the mining industry should really be taken into account when you're talking about increasing minimum and award wages, across the board. So a 4% claim for minimum and award wages that has been made by both Unions WA and WACOS is the only claim, in our view, that can satisfy the whole criteria that the Commission must consider in its decision. By being an increase at all, as in an increase above CPI, it will improve living standards. But by being an increase 1.5% more than that being asked for by the Minister, it takes account of the particular living costs that disproportionately impact low income earners, particularly non-discretionary items such as rent and energy consumption. And I should say that while we're talking about the impact of lockdowns on business, lockdowns also impact employees as well. And there are also issues around labour supply too, and certainty that employees have going forward. To that end, by maintaining the different rates of the WA and national minimum wages, the 4% claim recognises that living costs in WA are often greater than those in other parts of Australia. Historically, we can see that when WA's economy recovers, living costs can increase quite quickly, as has been demonstrated by increases in electricity disconnections and rental evictions once various moratoriums have been removed. So for the context of fair wage standards generally, the structure of the Unions WA claim not only preserves the margin for skill within award wage classifications, as we demonstrated using the example of the Metal Trades Award, it also brings the state award systems itself closer to average weekly earnings as a proportion, I should say, of average weekly ordinary time earnings. This has been identified in the WACOS submission. In maintaining the margin for skill and improving the proportion of wages in average weekly earnings, we're also looking to make the apprentice and trainee wages more attractive. And we think, once again, this is an important consideration within a closed labour market. We have made the point in this submission and other submissions that the standard of living for apprentices and trainees is important to recognise in minimum wage cases or in incomes generally. The apprentices may well start as an investment in their future earning potential, but they still have to earn an income over the course of that apprenticeship. Not all apprentices are kids straight out of high school. Sometimes they're living independently. Sometimes they have dependents as well. And it's been recognised that sometimes apprentice wages simply aren't enough to sustain the apprenticeship itself. So this is the sort of issue that needs to be considered. The Unions WA and WACOS claims recognise the criteria of protecting employees who cannot make an agreement and the state of the WA and national economy. These two factors are in fact intimately linked. The household consumption forecasts in both the federal budget and the outlook provided by the WA Treasury will rest on shaky foundations without actual wages growth. Those increases will need to come from our wage-setting institutions, and in this case, from increases to the minimum wage. Once again, the idea that we're simply going to sort of run on our savings just simply doesn't take account of the fact that many low-wage workers do not have these savings. My apologies, Commissioners. I don't usually run out of breath this quickly.
No, take your time, Dr. Diamond. We have plenty of it this afternoon.
Fair enough. So to reiterate, a substantial increase, in this case the 4% or $30.40, whichever is greater, is needed to overcome the wage inertias and freezes that are in place right across the private sector and, for that matter, the public sector. And only the Unions WA and WACOS have a claim that addresses all of these points. Now, the Commission has asked the parties to make comment on the research reports by Professor Jeff Borland, conducted for the Fair Work Commission on the economic effects of COVID-19. Once again, of course, the caveats of this is national data
Yes, quite.
And we have, of course, many situations where we're still learning about what's happened. But I don't know, perhaps we need a big neon sign, everything under advisement, so sort of just behind us.
Yes.
Unions WA notes at the beginning of the version 3 report, which discusses the source of a decline and rebound in real GDP since the March quarter of 2020, notes that the main driver of that were changes in household consumption. And Professor Borland makes the point that the changes in household consumption during 2020 were not due to changes in gross disposable income, which increased strongly in the June quarter and rose slightly for the rest of the year. He goes on to say these were due to changes in social assistance benefits, gross mixed income and employee compensation, partially offset by a decrease in net property income. Now, in our view, the social assistance component here is quite significant. They're, of course, across a range of both federal and state government support measures. For example, the Australia Institute recently found that in March 2020, the government lifted almost 500,000 Australians out of poverty, including 75,000 children, by introducing a coronavirus supplement worth $550 per fortnight. We conducted a fascinating and quite spectacularly successful experiment indeed in lifting people's incomes just through those coronavirus support measures of various kinds. However, the decision, of course, to remove that assistance, both JobKeeper and JobSeeker, demonstrates that expecting social assistance to continue to do the job of wages into the future in maintaining household consumption is inadequate. This is because even an extremely generous social assistance package will have a diluted impact because of its temporary nature. This can be seen or can be noted in Professor Borland's report when he points out that net saving grew by just over 4% over this period, and even allowing for the direct physical limitations on spending caused by lockdowns, people's knowledge that the assistance is one-off and temporary would naturally encourage caution. By contrast, a real wage increase delivers ongoing improvements to disposable incomes. This can be seen in the difference between the impact of tax cuts and wage rises. Annual compounding increases from wage rises deliver improvements in workers' income that are far better than the incremental increases in disposable income that can be attained through occasional tax cuts, or I'll go on to say by occasional bonuses as well. Professor Borland, in his research, report number 4, states on the page 4, that at this stage it does seem likely that the ending of JobKeeper caused at least a slowing of growth in jobs in Australia. Now, we've heard some varying reports about that over the course of the morning. Mr. Christmas was sort of perhaps more relaxed about the taking away of the impact of JobKeeper. But the impact of removing a measure like JobKeeper from the economy does raise the question of what's going to take its place. And under that sort of situation, it seems pretty obvious that we need for institutions to act to increase wages, because nothing else is going to do the job. Nothing else is going to do the job on an ongoing basis to maintain and improve that demand. And indeed, Professor Borland suggests that the table 1 on his report 4 might be a sign of the indication of that removal of JobKeeper. He notes that industries that include accommodation and food services all had relatively large decreases in jobs between late March and early April. Now, these decreases may represent seasonal effects, but they may also show an effect of JobKeeper ending. So the removal of JobKeeper, if it indeed had this effect of removing demand from the economy, really does indicate the need to replace that demand somehow, and that demand should be replaced by something that comes out of Australia's wages system. Now, Professor Borland does use clusters to assess the impact of COVID-19 in his various sort of levels of industry, and he does list those clusters, I think, on his report number 3, table 1. He does make the point, though, that there's varying sort of criteria by which those various industries could be included in various clusters. Unions WA would not support using clusters as a way of staggering the wage increase, similar to what the Fair Work Commission did last year. Given the uncertainty about which industries belong in which cluster, it seems to us that it would be far better to increase the minimum wage at the end of June, at the beginning of July, and rather than try and sort of make differential judgments about which industries are likely to be more affected than others. Professor Borland does, of course, make a general point about business performance, albeit across Australia, specifically profitability. And he also makes the point that while sales were low in 2020, as we would expect, the profit to sales ratio improved for businesses in 14 out of 15 industries in 2020 compared to 2017 to 19. Now, once again, bearing in mind some of these are national figures, and we're still waiting to see what the full impact will going to be. This does not, on the face of it, suggest that the primary thing that businesses are suffering from is excess labour costs and paying too much for their workforce. We think that the introduction of stronger wage increases, stronger sustained wage increases at the lower level into workers who are likely to spend as opposed to save their income is going to be of far greater benefit to the economy and spending power within the economy than simply maintaining a freeze or maintaining a variegated wage increase or maintaining a wage increase that would simply be too low. So with that in mind, Unions WA would reiterate that we should increase minimum wages by $30.40 a week or 4%, whatever is greater. That increase should apply from the 1st of June onwards. The decision to delay the 2020 increase until the first pay period after the 1st of January 2021, in our view, should not be repeated, and the full increases of the Act should be applied at all levels, including apprentices and juniors. To meet the needs of the low paid, binding institutional increases of wages, such as those created by minimum wages, are needed to bring about the increases in consumption that will support forecasts such as has been made by Treasury, Federal Treasury as well, and also by the Reserve Bank. In terms of whether Australia or Western Australia have a high minimum wage compared to other countries, we would argue that there's really no justification for the WA Industrial Relations Commission to pay attention to other countries' minimum wage decisions. They all have their own traditions of a wage setting. They all have varying significances of their minimum wage, if indeed they have a minimum wage at all. And this should be really given no consequence and no weight when it comes to making a minimum wage setting decisions. Insofar as minimum wages have in the past outpaced living costs, we think this is a good thing. And it should continue because we are talking about improving the position of low-wage workers, not simply sort of maintaining a level pegging, so to speak. In terms of what constitutes living wages and living costs, we have made the point, and WACOS will expand further, no doubt, that there are divergences between discretionary and non-discretionary CPI. We had a try of this in our initial submission, based on some material that we obtained from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And we think that simply assigning a point to say, something is higher than inflation, therefore it's automatically an improvement, should not be taken as read, which is why we don't simply support merely going above CPI, but we think it needs a substantial increase beyond CPI.
Is that experimental series an ongoing thing, do you know, Dr. Diamond, or was it just a one-off during the pandemic?
It was a one-off during the pandemic. They didn't, because you'll note that it went up to about September 2020. What they did was they had some of their research group and they published these things on a regular basis. Really, they're just attempting to have a go and see what sort of results that they came out with. But the results I thought were sufficiently interesting that I contacted them, and they said they had some results for Western Australia as well. So I extracted them and provided them for the for the Commission.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So to reiterate some of the other points, vulnerable groups of workers such as female workers are more likely to be overrepresented within the private sector of the state industrial relations system. This has been established. Workers with this profile are less likely to negotiate their own agreements and are more likely to be award reliant within the state system. So with that in mind, we argue that a substantial increase to the minimum wage is definitely needed for these workers. And noting once again the references to the research by Professor Preston, the ongoing gender pay gaps within Western Australia have been exacerbated, in our view, by successive governments doing very stifling public sector wages policies, and applying this to the private sector state award employees is going to be highly likely to continue this situation into the future, which is of course a major part of our criticism of the minister's position. Surveys have found, of course, that business conditions of confidence are well into positive territory in Western Australia and the state economy is recovering. Growth forecasts for the national economy are similarly positive. And so the lack of wage growth in WA and Australia, in our view, derives from the power of employers to decline to increase wages, not from simply having a competitive labour market. Therefore, that the increase of 4%, or $30.40, balances the range of factors, in our view, which the Commission must consider. It delivers the largest proportionate increase to the lowest paid while preserving the existing skills-based relativities in award classifications. Unions WA contends that while the COVID-19 crisis has been an unprecedented event, the economy is recovering. Not only can employers afford a minimum wage increase that improves living standards, there is also no good reason not to apply that increase from the end of June onwards. The annual adjustment to the minimum wage, national and state, is the most regular event in the Australian and WA IR calendar. So really everybody should be ready for it. Diluting its impact by delaying it puts award-reliant workers further behind, because living costs don't wait for the minimum wage increase in order for them to start increasing. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank the Commissioner in Court session for this opportunity. I'll conclude Unions WA's prepared remarks, but we reserve the right to make comment on other parties. Just to conclude, on the question of state wage principles, Unions WA is not making any submissions on this particular matter. And in terms of the Minister's recommendation about establishing a minimum rate of pay for award-free apprentices, Unions WA has no objection to the Minister's recommendation, and indeed acknowledges and thanks the Minister for taking the initiative on that point. And with that, the remarks are concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. John. Thank you. Mr. Twomey.
Thank you, Commissioners. If it pleases the Commission in Court session, I'd like to start by saying Kaya Nalakajik Wajak Noongar Mort Kan Karak Nijibuja, acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation. And I think it's important to give that recognition and also to recognise for First Nations people who are more dependent on minimum and award wages that the decisions we make here today can have a real impact on their lives. WACOS welcomes the opportunity to provide evidence and to advocate on behalf of both the services that are our members, but more particularly those low-income and vulnerable households that rely on their services. So we see as the peak body for the community services sector that the value we can bring to your deliberations is really going particularly to those questions in the Industrial Relations Act at 50A3 that talk to minimum pay rates meeting the needs of the low paid and providing fair wage standards in the context of living standards generally prevailing in the community. So in talking to these things, we seek to do so by both polling the experience of frontline services who are supporting many of those individuals and households, and also by reference to our ongoing economic and social research on the cost of living in WA and the impacts of poverty and inequality. And in doing that, we acknowledge the work and support that's been provided to us in this by Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and particularly the excellent work as well of Professor Alison Preston in this submission and in previous years. So there's a couple of key points that I wanted to just really highlight today in our submission. There were kind of three main areas. One is around the impacts and the learnings from the last period through COVID, particularly some issues around essential living costs, particularly the impacts around housing costs for low-income working households, and then some of the issues around minimum and award wages and gender pay equity. And I suppose in doing so, I highlight that in our submission we're talking particularly about a meaningful increase in the state minimum wage of 4%, and we're focused particularly in our submission around the needs of minimum wage earners. In talking about the COVID crisis and recovery, I think it's important to start by acknowledging that the West Australian community and economy have come through this crisis surprisingly well, and this was also very much highlighted in the Minister's submission around the economic outlook. I think it's important that we recognise there are a couple of key factors in our success, and that we also take some of the learnings away from what happened through the crisis. One is that we were fortunate in dodging the worst health impacts to our population, our health system and our mortality rate. Some of this was due to size and distance and population, but then also in how we responded to the crisis around containment measures, border controls and social distancing, but particularly as well how the community got behind these measures. And one of the things that I think was an important thing emerging from this was that the Australian community got behind the message that we were all in this together and really took it to heart. And we've seen a fundamental shift in the work that we've been doing around polling community attitudes to the vulnerable and disadvantaged. That was in response to seeing people at risk of losing their jobs and their livelihoods as a result of a pandemic that was beyond their control. Why I think this is important is that we think there's been a shift in the perceptions and concerns around fairness, and that this also goes to these issues around prevailing community standards and what the community wanted to see coming through the crisis and coming out of the crisis in making sure that no one was left behind. The second clear factor that comes through in the evidence that's been presented this morning has been around the resilience of our economy, and in particular due to significant investment we saw in economic stimulus targeting those most at risk of financial hardship, along with our strong ongoing exports, as we've talked, particularly iron ore going to China. It is important to recognise that, as Unions WA were alluding to, this was a once-off incredible social experiment in terms of we saw that $90 billion going alone into the JobKeeper package and significant investments in raising dramatically the incomes of those relying on income support for a period of time. This made a huge difference, both in our ability to keep individuals and households who were impacted by the containment measures connected to work and out of financial hardship, and to help them to avoid the barriers that come with that hardship to their ability to either maintain the connection or find a new connection to workplaces. But the other thing I think was critical was the evidence of the impact of increasing the disposable income on those on the lowest incomes in our community, on the impact that had on the health and resilience of our economy, was incredibly strong and incontrovertible, because we saw very clearly that any extra money that was going to those on the lower incomes was getting spent straight away on essential goods and services in the local economy, and that we saw that where they had debts, where they had barriers to health and wellbeing outcomes or barriers to their participation in the workforce, they targeted those with their investments and savings. And so there was a very strong lesson that came out of that for us. But it also highlighted the message that a fair and inclusive economy is also a resilient one. I guess the other point that is important around this is that we also, with this shift in community attitudes, we also saw a dramatic shift in our national debate around the economy and the economic narrative that's been leading the debate for the last decade or two. And we shifted very dramatically from this debt and deficit disaster narrative to a real focus on supporting the community, coming through this, looking at the resilience of our economy. But it also very much showed that ending poverty could be a political choice. It was a choice around how we chose to invest those public resources, acknowledging that it was a very huge amount of money that was invested into those stimulus measures. I'd also then point out, as we've heard in the discussion this morning and in the comments last month from Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, that as these economic stimulus measures are withdrawn, there's a real question about what's going to underpin growth and resilience in our economy going forwards, and that there's been a discussion now about the importance of real wages growth in doing that. Obviously, this is a balance. It is important to note now that unemployment is lower now than it was pre-pandemic, and we've also seen that when it's actually come to hours work issues around underemployment. There is very much some patchiness, there are some skill shortages. We've very much in some areas got a two-speed economy. But overall, our gross state product is forecast to grow 2% this year and 2.75% in the following year. However, as we discussed earlier and in the questions I raised, we're still seeing wages projected to stay very flat, in line with CPI over the next 2 years. And this follows a period of sustained low wage growth in WA. We've seen the wages price index below 2% since 2014 and dropping to 1.6% in 2020. This is in spite of the economic outlook pointing to increased consumer confidence and predicting growth in consumer spending over forward estimates. And we do note that the CCI WA Consumer Confidence Survey hit an 8-year high in March. So to sum this up, we believe on the balance of the evidence that an increase to the minimum wage of 4% is affordable and appropriate in the current economic climate, and that we need to see some meaningful wage growth to strengthen and deepen our economic recovery so the benefits we have seen to date are shared more equally and our economy is more resilient in the longer term. One of the issues that I particularly wanted to talk to today was around essential living costs, and particularly the issues around housing that you'll note I also raised in my questions with Mr. Christmas. Because our concern is that the reliance on CPI as a measure of living costs can at times be incredibly misleading. And the biggest thing that is concerning us when it comes to low-income and vulnerable households, those reliant on our services, has been the impacts of the end of the rental moratorium in March and the dramatic increase that we've seen in low-income affordable rental availability and median rental prices going up dramatically. One of the things that we note is that we had this strange COVID spike in population growth here, with both expats coming back here and also Western Australians moving back from the eastern states here. So we had a 3.8% population growth at a time whereas the data around our housing market shows there had been very little investment. And the problem still remains that the investment that we saw and we have been seeing under the latest housing stimulus measures isn't actually targeted to low-income affordable rental. It tends to be targeted in other places, and in fact one of the issues that we've seen has been a lot of this stimulus is potentially creating some problems and some of these two-speed issues within the economy. And just to divert for a second, one of the big concerns and criticisms we've put of that is that the impacts that we saw around the COVID crisis was particularly on the work of women and young people, whereas the stimulus investment we've seen has particularly gone to male-dominated industries. And so we've been really concerned that we were responding in our stimulus to our last crisis, not to the current one, and that we really needed to be thinking and doing more about actually investing and targeting those people that were most at risk, would most benefit from the stimulus and would most convey that benefit to the wider economy. So one of the things that's particularly important here is that we know that rental housing for minimum wage households is increasingly unaffordable, and it's also the single largest component of their household budgets. So the data that we shared in our submission shows the weekly median rent for a unit accounts for over 51% of the minimum wage, and for a house is around 57%. So so this means even the smallest changes in rent can have a dramatic increase on living standards and the ability of minimum wage households to actually meet other living costs. And so while we can point to CPI and say it hasn't gone up much, when we're talking about a 10 to 15% increase in rental prices that's being predicted to happen throughout 2021, that is a significant impact when it's representing half of your budget. So that is a particular concern that we're facing now. I note that there was some important work that was done recently by the Housing Emergency Response Group that we made some reference to in our submission around surveying through April a number of frontline services to get some measures around the impact of that. Some of the things that we saw there that we've alluded to have been requests for tenancy support with emergency relief providers going up 15 to 20%. We've seen a 43% increase in people seeking emergency relief for the first time, specifically for housing and emergency accommodation. Those services that have the capacity to record turnaway data have reported a 50 to 100% increase in the number of people they're not able to service. And there are some other indicators as well. We know the Department of Commerce has been tracking the increased calls and notices for people wanting to terminate leases or reporting a substantial rent increase. That's dramatically gone up. We've seen Circle Green Community Legal, who are the key provider of tenancy advice, have recorded a 500% increase in calls. That's gone from 30 a day to 200 a day.
Did they give you the period?
I'll take that on notice and get back to you on that.
But 500% increase, you said?
Yes. Yes, I should be able to find that. I'll come back to you on that. Basically, the point across these figures is that we are seeing the first indications of an emerging crisis, that is the squeeze at the bottom end of the rental market that impacts on those on minimum wage or reliant on award wages, and that because we've seen a long-term underinvestment in this, that both our stimulus measures but our housing investment more general has not been geared at low income affordable rental. We've got a real gap there, and the gap that we now have in that area is the worst it's ever been here. And so our rental vacancy rate is the lowest ever. We've seen dramatic increases. The median rental now for a unit has gone up to $430 a week. These things are having a disproportionate impact on those cost of living impacts on those lower income households. The other issue that I wanted to mention, so because of the fact that we represent the community services sector, WACOS is particularly concerned around issues to do with gender equity and the gender pay gap. So we've been engaging in looking at that. Just to put that in context, 82% of our workforce in health and social services is women, and in Western Australia we've got a 9.6% gender pay gap, and that has not been improving over the last few years. And one of our concerns there is that these are predominantly services that are then reliant on public philanthropic funding or people paying small amounts to get access to those services, and hence there is a real struggle there around getting decent pay in those areas. So hence we remain concerned that when it comes to WA overall, gender pay gap, depending on which figures you look at, it's either 20.4% on the ABS figures compared to 20% nationally, or if you look at the WGEA ones, which tends to pick up the larger industry more, it's 22.9% compared to 16.3% nationally. In either way, we've got a much bigger gender pay gap here. Some of that reflects the composition of our economy, but one of the things that's a real issue is that gender pay gap has been more persistent in those female-dominated areas here, and we've been seeing less progress in those areas. And so that remains a concern to us because we know that working women and their households are much more reliant on minimum wage and award wage settings, and hence there is a real role that wage setting processes can play in actually delivering equitable outcomes there. There are a couple of other things I will just reflect on very quickly in passing. I did want to highlight the issue. We provided some evidence in our submission around the cost of living, what it actually costs to live in regional areas in WA.
Yes.
And we wanted to highlight that Section 50A3A2 talks to living standards generally, not living costs. So the point I think there is that in considering the adequacy of wages and the ability for people reliant on award or minimum wages to live anywhere in Western Australia, what is the standard of living that they're actually able to achieve there? And what we have seen is that varies dramatically across the state, and it's particularly difficult in a lot of our regional areas. And so we believe that it is a relevant consideration in terms of setting award and minimum wages. One other thing that I did want to highlight was issues around the importance of also then reflecting on what minimum award wages mean for young people in Western Australia.
Yes, thank you.
So in particular, we point to the research undertaken by the Productivity Commission that has demonstrated stagnant real wages for young people have been the main contributor to decline in average income of young people over the last decade, due to an oversupply of workers and an undersupply of well-paid jobs. This is the thing that for us remains a real concern, rather than the comments made by CCI saying that this was really around their lack of skills and experience. And so our concern is going forward, particularly when we then see rising housing costs, the exclusion from the housing market, that the health and well-being of young people and our community and economy going forward is really impacted by their circumstances there. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. Just in concluding, I wanted to really come back to this point around the learnings that we've seen from this crisis, but particularly around the importance that we see of the role of the state minimum wage and actually lifting minimum wages as reducing inequality within the community, and the extent to which a fair and inclusive economy is one that is more resilient, and that it supports a healthy and more harmonious community. We see from our point of view, the more that we can do in our advocacy to actually improve the circumstances of those on the lowest incomes will have the greatest impact to the broader wellbeing of our community. So on that basis, I commend our submission to you. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Truman. Thank you again. We note that you've commented, in part at least, on each other's submissions, but is there any replies that any of you wish to make? Because if you do so, now of course take the opportunity. Mr. Entrecott, Mr. Moss?
Yes, close to the Commissioner Court session, only a few very short comments or stimmies. And I'll stress that we do rely on our submissions and reply and the comments that were made previously today. I'd just like to highlight what we did make in our submission and to reinforce our concerns about the risk of unpacking CPI. In particular, in focusing on a particular area, consideration isn't given to what else is happening in that particular space, and the issue of relevance of CPI is an issue that's been debated and considered previously in state wage case decisions, and would reinforce that element there as well. A lot of comments been made with respect to the current low levels of wage growth, and I'll put that in inverted commas, but I would reinforce that if we looked at, and not too far ago, with the resource-led construction boom that we had very high levels of wage growth, and that's a good reflection of where the market was and the impact of a strong economy, strong demand for growth, strong demand for skilled work in driving wages up. And the thing is, and the cycle that we have in the economy and where we are does have a significant impact on wages growth and wages affordability. The high wages growth that we had in 2014 and prior to that as well, those gains haven't been lost, and that's seen in the WOTI. We have a very strong average weekly ordinary time earnings, and that's because having wage in growth around or coming up towards the 5% mark, we've continued to have wage growth, and while that wage growth has been lower, we've not gone into negative wage growth. So we've not lost the gains that we had during the higher economic cycles. It's just that the wage growth has been lower. It still has that cumulative effect, and we've seen that with state wage case decisions as well. We've had the higher increases, and whilst wage growth has been lower, you've still got the cumulative benefit of those previous decisions and the cumulative benefit of previous wage growth. So there's not been loss in that respect, but we do need to recognise that prior to the pandemic, the economic circumstances of Western Australia had declined significantly post the economic boom, and going into the COVID-19 pandemic, we were at that particular time hopeful of greater growth within the WA economy and the real building of the WA economy. And we used the CCI at the time, just prior to the pandemic, was using the reference that WA economy was waiting for the next wave. The problem is we didn't get a wave. We got COVID-19 instead. So I'd just like to make that comment with respect to the issue about wage growth and the concern that Unions WA about employers working in almost in concert to keep wage growth low. It's a reflection of where the economy is at a particular point in time. We do note the comments that WACOS has made about the benefit that the government stimulus has had, particularly with like JobKeeper and JobSeeker, in increasing the income that people have had. And yes, that does have a positive benefit. The question that we do need to keep coming back to, though, is affordability. Who is paying for it? The JobKeeper, the JobSeeker and the other government stimulus that's been injected in by both federal and state governments, it is certainly much needed and appreciated and appropriate at this particular point of time, but it comes at a cost. And that cost, in that respect, is a massive deficit that's going to take quite a long period of time to recover back and repay from. Now, it's a wise investment, and an investment that the government can make, but that increased income needs to be payable, it needs to be affordable. And hence why things like JobKeeper and JobSeeker need to come to an end, is because it's not affordable sustainably in the long term. Seeking to almost replace the benefit of JobKeeper and JobSeeker through high increase in minimum wage raises the same issue. Is it affordable? Who's bearing the cost of that? Can they bear the cost of that ongoing? And we'd just like to reinforce as well that with some of the social issues, so once again, WACOS raises the issue about housing affordability. And it is a real issue and a significant issue that needs to be dealt with. The question becomes, however, can the minimum wage fix it? And our view is it doesn't. There are a number of issues associated with housing affordability. Clearly raised, you have an increased population as a result of the impact of closed borders and the role that has played in turning around what in WA had prior to that with negative population growth to suddenly a big and very quick upshot in that growth, and one which wasn't necessarily planned or considered for. And then in addition to other government policies which, whilst aimed at protecting renters, also then discouraged investment in rental properties and investment properties elements there as well. Our concern is that the minimum wage would be a very blunt instrument indeed to try and correct those deficiencies. And so the concern that we do raise is adjustment of the minimum wage isn't unfortunately a solution for all the social problems. There are other triggers and other things that need to be done that will have a more meaningful and direct impact on resolving those social issues. If it pleases the Commission, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moss. Mr. Entrant, did you wish to make any
Thank you,
replies?
Chief Commissioner. I'll just make some brief comments. Like Mr. Moss, will mostly stand on our submission in reply in relation to those issues. Just a couple of things that I would note, though. I know there was some discussion today about the aggregate hours worked or total hours worked across the labour force in Western Australia. And I do just note that today's labour force figures indicate that the total number of hours worked in the month of April 2021 is on par with February 2020, so it's effectively the same as what it was before. It has come down a little bit from March, and probably the school holidays would pick up some of that. In actual fact, we believe the lockdown probably won't be factored into that figure because the lockdown came late in the month after the labour force survey was conducted, so you might find potentially that doesn't show up in the data. But the longer term trend, I guess, along with underemployment coming down to the lowest level in a number of years as well, is that certainly aggregate hours worked has recovered to where it was pre-pandemic. In terms of lockdowns themselves, without wanting to get into any debate about how they should be tackled. We do note that having the short, sharp lockdowns in February and April, as inconvenient as they were, may well have saved off a much longer period of close down. And I think there's a lot of discussion today about Victoria and how Victoria's figures in a range of areas are weaker than Australia as a whole, and that was borne out in Professor Borland's research as well. And Victoria was locked down for a significant period of time. I think it was over 100 days. And so obviously, as inconvenient or painful as they might be, the short, sharp lockdowns may well have saved something much worse for the WA economy. I'll just touch on the CPI issue. So Mr Christmas had highlighted the CPI figures that are the projections for Treasury, and they came out of the pre-election financial projection statement. Treasury itself is now, for official budget purposes, is now forecasting inflation minus the electricity component. That's not because it's trying to unpack CPI or pick out the bits that suit it or don't suit it. It's just because the way that the household electricity component was treated statistically has so distorted the inflation that it doesn't actually show an accurate picture. What actually happened was when it was actually implemented, it showed up as a 67% decline in electricity prices in the CPI, and of course prices hadn't gone down at all. It was a household credit.
Sure, people would like to see that in their bills.
Yes,
2 months.
absolutely. It would be wonderful if it was permanent, but it's because of the way it's treated statistically, and I know that the way that the grants are treated statistically is in itself a controversial topic amongst economists and statisticians. It was so distortionary that Treasury itself has had to go away from, or had to use a measure that excludes the electricity component. And Treasury, WA Treasury has always used annual averages, which smooths the data a little bit. You'll note that in the Commonwealth budget papers, which came out last week, there is a very high figure for headline CPI for 2020-21, about 3.5%. But nobody is suggesting that underlying inflation is actually 3.5%. It's just coming off a really low base from 12 months earlier. There was a significant drop and then a significant increase. But it has been distorted a lot by COVID measures. So there's never been as much distortion of the CPI data as the last year, along with all of the government programs and support measures and what have you. So that, I guess, partially explains why
Yes, understood.
the
Thank you.
1.5% figure is being used. Just touching on something Unions WA have raised, the household savings issue, and Mr Christmas's figures for that. I just note, I don't think Mr Christmas is suggesting that all minimum wage earners can go out and buy a brand new car tomorrow or a Mazda 3 or what have you. But I think when he was talking about the household savings rate, talking in aggregate terms, so he's talking about spending in the aggregate across the economy, and in the aggregate, Western Australia happens to have a higher household savings rate at the moment, and therefore there is potentially a slightly greater capacity to run that down, I guess, if you speak. But again, it's all in aggregate terms. It's not. He's not suggesting that that's reflective of every
Individual.
individual.
Yes,
Yeah,
understand.
certainly. Just on the gender pay gap, I know it's an issue of concern to many parties, and it is to the government as well. One thing that is unfortunately tends to be the case is, Western Australia does have a very gendered workforce, and certainly we'd agree with WACOS on that, and that partly explains some of the high level of the gender pay gap in Western Australia. What you often find also is that when there is increased economic activity, especially in mining, that does sometimes flow through to a heightened gender pay gap naturally. Obviously, we'd all like to see it come down, but sometimes macroeconomic circumstances will weigh on the gender pay gap because of the composition of the WA labour market in that sense. I do know that a number of people have raised the issue of the WA government surplus. While I certainly am not in a position to project or comment on it, one point that is worth noting is that net debt is actually still increasing at the same time as the surplus. The surplus is extremely volatile because of the iron ore price, and that every time the iron ore price goes up or down, it means millions and millions of dollars of difference in the level of the surplus. But certainly WA government net debt is still increasing, so all of that surplus is being spent. So there's a lot of infrastructure programs and a lot of spending going on. So it's not that the government is sitting on a giant pot.
It's not a bank account full of
It's
cash.
not a bank account full of
Understood.
cash. Exactly.
Yes, it's allocated for infrastructure and capital investment.
Exactly.
And the higher the surplus, the less the borrowings commitments.
Exactly,
Yes.
Chief Commissioner, yes. That was all that I wanted to speak
Thank you
on.
very
Thank
much
you,
for
Chief
that,
Commissioner.
Dr. Diamond? Anything from
Yes.
you?
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Just responding very quickly to what the other parties have said. Look, in terms of whether employers need to conspire together to restrain wages, no conspiracy is necessary, just a simple recognition by each of them that they're price takers in the labour market. And they recognise, or rather, more to the point, the Reserve Bank, when it conducts its firm liaison and detects various levels of wage freezes, which it includes in its statement on monetary policy, certainly doesn't allege or require any conspiracy on the conspiracy theory to make that work. What employers, of course, are responding to, or more to the point, not responding to, is where the pressure for a wage increase comes from. Unions WA has argued in this wage case that it needs to come from institutional action. I would say that, of course, wage growth has been higher at various stages in the past, even in the recent past here in Western Australia. And insofar as we have in fact retained the benefit of those wage increases, it's precisely because of the institutional action of our industrial relations system that actually allows that to take place. I should say prior to the pandemic, we did indeed have record low wage growth across various parts of Australia, and part of the point that certainly unions made at the time was that notwithstanding interest rates were very low, productivity figures were regularly out of whack, if you like, or they had a strong separation between wage increases and productivity increases. We even debated it in this forum as well at various times about the gap between wages and productivity. So in our view, the actions within the labour market that increase wages are very strongly influenced by institutional outcomes. And if you put aside the institutional outcomes and wait for employers acting, we think that it's going to take an extremely long time in that regard. And on the point of sort of what happens with various people's savings and how that would play in, insofar as like we are making an aggregate judgment about people reaching into their savings to maintain domestic consumption, that just goes back to the earlier point that not everybody has access to those levels of saving. And paying attention to the needs of the low paid is a crucial decision that this commission needs to make. And as I say, the reason why we have a minimum wage system, the reason why we have award wages is precisely to take into account the fact that the low paid need that institutional pay increase that reaches across reaches across state award covered employers. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Diamond. Mr. Twomey, I don't know whether you wish to add anything. given that you are suppose
yes.
the last in the line. But
Just a
if
couple
you
of
do,
things
please do.
very quickly. I won't hold you for long.
No, not at all.
I wanted to talk to this point particularly around housing affordability and the suggestion that I was calling on the Commission to fix social problems. The references that I was making to median rental costs was specifically just going to that point at 50A 3A where it's talking about having regard to what are the essential living costs, what is the community standard. I'm by no way saying that minimum wage or award wages is going to fix these issues. I'm merely pointing out that because of the lack of provision of affordable housing, we need to take these things into account. Certainly it would be ideal if we had other policy mechanisms that were addressing those. Minimum wage isn't the way to do that, but the minimum wage very much needs to think about affordability. The second thing that I wanted to note was the discussion around savings, just to put that a bit in context of some of the data that we've been seeing from emergency relief providers and making it very clear that we're talking about different cohorts here. So on the one hand, we've seen a real impact on those who had been long-term reliant on income support, living in poverty, who saw a dramatic increase to their income because of the stimulus measures around JobSeeker in particular. There is actually another group out there who are the ones who lost work and lost hours, have found themselves in financial hardship for the first time. And so what we have seen is among those people coming to emergency relief services for the first time, there has been an increase in the levels of debt that they're carrying, and that we're looking at an average of $3,000 in rental arrears that they're dealing with. And this is one of these impacts of the combination of the loss of work during that downturn and the rental moratorium. People in crisis stopped paying their rent, but they were accruing a debt when they did so, and now they're dealing with the consequences of that. The other thing I just wanted to mention in passing was there was the discussion around the gender pay gap. And I would say that the WA's gender pay gap is not just a compositional effect, and the breakdowns that you see in the recent WGEA BCEC gender report, for example, actually show that the gender pay gap within WA is also higher on an industry by industry basis, not simply on a whole of economy level. So it is still a concern, and it remains a concern in a lot of these areas that are female dominated industries as well. And in fact, although the gap is bigger in some areas like mining and finance, they are the places where we've actually seen more progress in reducing the gap. Whereas perversely, a lot of these places like health and social services that are female-dominated industries, we're not seeing any progress on closing the gap. So I just wanted to point that out, and that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Twomey. Very well. Well, thank you very much for your written and oral submissions today. They've been extremely helpful to us. In accordance with the programming, we are going to reconvene once the Fair Work Commission hands down its decision, and in the meantime, when the national accounts are released on the 4th of June, we'll receive brief submissions from you in relation to those. So we'll adjourn until that time, and thanks again for your assistance today.
We stand adjourned.